Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a State of the Class video about Vengeance Demon Hunters. I've saved the best for last. Initially I'd written a bit of waffling back and forth here, but in the weeks since I started working on this and now, Blizzard has buffed the class several more times. They even buffed it last night while I was asleep. So what we know for sure is that Vengeance Demon Hunter is getting a massive rework with patch 10.2, and what we know from testing is that it is much stronger in Mythic Plus than it already was in Season 2 when it was reasonably competitive. I've had to rewrite several sections of this video as Blizzard continues working on the class, but basically every rewrite has gone like this. I delete the section where I say Blizzard has slightly buffed the class, and replace it with a section that says Blizzard has substantially buffed the class. To be honest, I kind of wanted to wait even longer to put this out, but at some point I had to step back and think about what the point of these videos is, and clearly it's to give people an idea of how each tank is performing and what playing it feels like as we head into patch 10.2. And at some point if I wait until patch 10.2 is out, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? So here we are. Blizzard still probably isn't done. They're going to be continuing to work on Demon Hunter until the last minute, and then probably a whole bunch more after the patch is out. But for now, here's how the class looks. It looks overpowered. So let's just start out by Infernal striking directly into Vengeance Demon Hunter history, because that part is going to be pretty brief compared to the other 5 tanks. Then once we've gone through that, we're going to devote the rest of the video to the class changes, which are comprehensive. Demon Hunter was added in Legion, and it basically just borrowed components of every other tank's toolkit. It got self-healing that's sort of like Death Knight. Initially, that healing was a flat amount based on attack power. It didn't scale with damage taken like Death Knight's Death Strike until it was reworked in Battle for Azeroth, but this is still self-healing, kind of like DK. It got Demon Spikes that would reduce your physical damage taken and sort of worked like Shield of the Righteous and Shield Block did at the time, back before those two skills had 100% uptime. Demon Hunter had amazing AoE damage tools like Brewmaster Monk, and it had weird defensive cooldowns that kind of didn't function like any of the other tanks and also kind of sucked. So how did the class do? It wasn't great. Of the 3 times that Blizzard has added a new tank, Demon Hunter was the only one that landed with a thud. Death Knight was very successful in Wrath, and it wound up redefining how tanks have functioned in Cataclysm and all the way up until now. Brewmaster Monk was very popular at the start of Mists of Pandaria. It started out pretty well, then it got some buffs in the first 2 major patches of the expansion. The Vengeance mechanic got reworked, and before the end of Mists of Pandaria, Brewmaster Monk was the strongest spec in the history of the game, literally the #1 of all time. That has never been challenged. By comparison, Vengeance Demon Hunter started out slow, and it still wasn't great by the time Nighthold and Tomb of Sargeras came along. Deep into Tomb of Sargeras Farm, it got major buffs that made it pretty competitive, and finally it became decent in the final tier of the expansion in which it was added. So what was the grand total of world first end boss kills that had a Vengeance Demon Hunter in them in Legion? 0. How about BFA? 0. How about Shadowlands? Actually, yes, 1. Castle Nathria. That is the one and only time in the 11 tiers since Vengeance Demon Hunter was added to the game that it has been used in a world first raid kill. So that's not great, and I think it helps establish my thesis statement for Vengeance Demon Hunters in this video. It is a spec without an identity. It takes a bunch from other specs and creates something that is good, fun, and can be great in Mythic Plus, but it's hardly ever competitive in raids. There's almost always another tank that does the job better, and usually there are several. Now, I say this as somebody who has played a lot of Demon Hunter and Raid in the past couple of expansions due to Blizzard's evil debuff matrix. It's fun, I like it, it's one of my favorite tanks, and I enjoy playing it in Raid even though it is deeply inconsistent in single target. It is that way because of a resource system and ability design that rewards you for being an AoE. This design is why it's great in Mythic Plus, but it kind of makes the class suck in Raids, and that's why it's just not that popular there. Sometimes the single target damage in raids is good, but usually it's not. Sometimes its defenses are super strong and reliable in raids, but most of the time they're not. The one aspect of the game in which Vengeance Demon Hunter has consistently been pretty good throughout its entire lifespan is Mythic Plus. It has a toolkit that scales really well with target count. For example, Demon Hunter does a lot of AoE damage. It also heals for a percentage of the damage it deals, so scaling into AoE is kind of an important component of the class's defensive toolkit. So thus far, this all sounds pretty bad, but I think it's a little misleading. DH is not as bad as some of the player representation numbers over the history of the class would make it look. So once again, let's use some questions to try and examine the problems with the class historically and what Blizzard can do to fix it moving forward. Alright, first off, does Vengeance have a unique identity? Does it have anything it does that is actually unique? And can Blizzard take this weird, interesting, fun mess of a class and turn it into something that's competitive in high-level raids? So we already answered the first question, but Vengeance's entire identity is built out of pieces of all the other tanks. It's a hodgepodge, a kludge, a melting pot. I guess on some level that's sort of an identity. I think the one thing that Vengeance does that's unique as a tank is that it has a very high parry chance compared to the other 5 classes. Monk has high dodge, so it's sort of similar to something that another class does, but it's implemented in a very different way. Monk's mastery makes it ramp up its chance to dodge each time it's hit until it gets a guaranteed dodge. Vengeance just has a high baseline parry chance. This is really good against auto attack damage, which is really good in Mythic Plus, and really isn't that great in raids. In terms of a unique power, Vengeance does have one. It's Sigils, a whole class of ground-targeted cooldown spells that deal damage or apply some kind of crowd control. So we're talking about Fear, Silence, and AoE Grip. Back in Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard gave Demon Hunters an Azerite trait called Cycle of Binding. Cycle of Binding granted cooldown reduction and a ton of agility whenever you affected an enemy with a sigil, and this was the catalyst that made Demon Hunters pretty fun and pretty good in BFA Mythic Plus. It was the point when I finally started to enjoy playing Demon Hunters. Then Shadowlands came along and Cycle of Binding went away. A highly altered version of it was brought back as a Shadowlands Legendary that gave you cooldown reduction when you used Soul Cleave, but you had a very different playstyle. It was fine, but not nearly as interesting or good. Cycle of Binding was reintroduced as a talent in Dragonflight, but its position in the talent tree, combined with some very low-value talents along the way, have pretty much rendered it unusable. Until patch 10.2. And I think that's really the answer to both the second and third questions, and the driving force for the rest of this video. Blizzard has finally, after 7 years, decided to flesh out sigils and use them as a defining mechanism by which they will establish a unique identity for Vengeance Demon Hunters. So one of the main areas of complaint about Demon Hunters in raids is in their cooldowns. Let's talk about them now. These are your main defensive cooldowns as a Demon Hunter. Fiery Brand is a single target shield wall. It's on a 1-minute cooldown, it's on the global cooldown, and it grants 40% damage reduction against your primary target. Now, a 1-minute cooldown is pretty short, that aspect of it is nice. It can also spread to other targets with the talent Burning Alive, which is very popular in AoE situations. It sort of becomes like a normal multi-target shield wall in that case, and it deals a lot of damage. It also increases your fire damage against the target by 50% in 10.2, so it's doing double duty as both an offensive and defensive cooldown, which is kinda neat, but also kind of annoying because that means if you have to hold on to it to stay alive, you're losing a ton of damage. The real problem with it is it doesn't affect environmental damage, and raids are flooded with environmental damage. So if you need to mitigate some kind of knockback or ground fire or any mechanic that deals a lot of damage but isn't specifically coded to come from boss enemy 1, and there are tons of those, Demon Hunter can't do anything about it. You just have to kind of like live and hope for healing. Your other defensive cooldown is Metamorphosis, which is your more all-purpose defensive cooldown. It's analogous to Shield Wall in terms of the cooldown and the situations in which you would use it, but it's actually more like a last stand. It's a longer cooldown, reduced to 2 minutes with talents in patch 10.2. It grants 50% bonus health, 200% more armor, and more resource generation in the 15 seconds it's active. You'll note that it doesn't grant any actual damage reduction. And that's it. You can get an occasional Metamorphosis proc from Fell Devastation, which is now a 40-second cooldown that does a bunch of AoE damage and healing to you. But again, that's it. It's just giving you a little bit of Metamorphosis, and then you also have Metamorphosis, and you have Fiery Brand. I mean, talk about a tiny little toolkit. It's extremely limited compared to other tanks. Instead, what Demon Hunters get is a lot of damage reduction, and that comes in both passive and active forms. You get 10% damage reduction from all sources from the passive Demonic Wards. You get 5% passive magic damage reduction from the talent Illidari Knowledge. They get up to 12% damage reduction, about 6% on average, from the talent Calcified Spikes. They get about 8% damage reduction on average from the talent Painbringer. They can talent into 12% bonus magic damage reduction while Immolation Aura is active. You can get up to like 30% damage reduction through the talent Frailty, although that's generally more like 8 to 12% on average. All these numbers are from the new talent tree, do not step to me on anything that's changed. So is all this damage reduction heavy approach good enough to make Demon Hunters competitive in raids? I think one raid out of the last 11 would indicate that no, hell no, it absolutely is not competitive. At least not at the highest level. A big part of the problem here is that Demon Hunters suffer from the biggest issue plaguing Death Knights. They need to be in melee range in order to do anything defensively. They can't generate or spend resources from range. They can't heal from range. They can't generate any of those tons of active damage reduction layers from range. Every raid has some points where boss mechanics force tanks out of range. Demon Hunters are pretty good at getting out of range and back in, but during the period where you're gonna be out of range, you're like desperate to not die, and the only thing keeping you alive is healers. Amir Drasil looks like it's gonna be pretty heavy on those mechanics. That's bad for DH. And unlike Death Knight, who has a robust defensive cooldown toolkit that can help them mitigate some of the damage at range and stay alive long enough for a healer to keep them going, and then burst back to full health once they get back into melee range and hit Death Strike once, Demon Hunter has no mid-level cooldowns to rely on. It's Fiery Brand and Metamorphosis and hope you don't die. That's not a great strategy. Then once you get back into melee range, you can't just Death Strike back to full. Your healing is nowhere near that strong. You don't have the soul fragments built up that you need to heal, so it's like 5 seconds of ramp up before you can begin to heal again and start catching up on all of the stacking damage reduction layers you have. This is all exacerbated by Frailty, which at its baseline is a leech buff. It grants you 10% leech. Pretty good. But depending on talents, it can stack repeatedly, sitting around 3 to 5 stacks on average, and it can grant damage reduction and increased damage as well, which is fantastic. Generally speaking, it's a really good mechanic. I really like Frailty. The problem with it is just that it doubles down on Demon Hunter and DK's biggest problem in raids, the things that make Demon Hunter a liability. It punishes you for having to deal with boss mechanics, and it scales far better into AoE than it does in single target. Now, if you think about this game from a starting point of how does this affect raids, which I tend to do, this all sounds bad. Inconsistent damage reduction, susceptibility to doing boss mechanics, lack of effectiveness in single target. This sucks. But if you're looking at it from a Mythic Plus angle, this is all basically great. Tons of layers of damage reduction, great self-healing that scales linearly with your target count, lots of AoE damage, high parry chance, lots and lots of AoE crowd control, and the ability to silence packs of caster mobs for long periods of time. This is perfect. There's something very interesting to me about the fact that Demon Hunter was introduced to the game at the same time as Mythic Plus, and that it has been a fantastic Mythic Plus tank for most of its existence. I don't think it's a deliberate plan by Blizzard. I really don't. I think it's just a happy coincidence, but man, what a coincidence it is. I couldn't have scripted it better myself. There's really only one other thing about Demon Hunter that is bad, everybody hates, and if you play Demon Hunter, you're just gonna kind of have to deal with. Soul Fragments. Of all the resources that have existed in the history of WoW, Soul Fragments are the worst one. You see, despite the fact that Demon Hunter only has one resource bar for Fury, they have 2 resources that fuel their ability usage. Your main Fury generators, Fracture and Immolation Aura, also create Soul Fragments. Some of your other cooldowns do as well. Soul Fragments are little healing spheres that exist in physical space, and if you run into them, you consume them just like a monk's Gift of the Ox Orbs. They'll heal you for a percentage of all the damage you've taken in the past 5 seconds, like a Death Knight's Death Strike. Some parts of in-game terrain, like cracks on the floor, can force soul fragments to spawn directly on top of you as soon as they're created, causing them to be instantly consumed. This sucks because the point of soul fragments, the way you're supposed to use them, is with Spirit Bomb. Spirit Bomb is your main Fury spender. It costs 40 Fury, and when you press it, it consumes all of your soul fragments, healing you for the normal amount of so you'd picked them up, and dealing AoE damage for each fragment consumed. It also applies the frailty debuff that I've mentioned before. Spirit Bomb is an amazing AoE damage spell. It's the core component of your rotation. It's usually your #1 damage skill, and the outdated terrible design of soul fragments makes it unwieldy to use. If you move, you will probably eat some soul fragments. That means you lose damage. It also means you lose healing since the class is so heavily built around leeching damage. But wait, there's more. Soul fragments aren't just annoying objects that exist in physical space and can be accidentally consumed through movement. They also have an enraging delay on spawning. So if you wanted to jump into a pack of enemies, hit Immolation Aura, spawn 5 soul fragments, and then hit Spirit Bomb, you can't do that. You have to jump into the pack of enemies, hit Immolation Aura, spawn 5 soul fragments, wait 2/3 of a second for them to actually spawn, and then hit Spirit Bomb. Rotationally, you would want to hit Fracture or something like that during that half-second window. But Fracture would spawn more soul fragments, and going over the cap of 5 causes older fragments to just get automatically consumed, so you definitely don't want to do that. That's wasted damage. So you leap in, cast Immolation Aura, wait a bit, then you get to use Spirit Bomb, Fracture, and proceed with the rotation. You don't want to let Fracture sit on cooldown, it's your best resource generator, but you have to, because the resource system is structured in a way that constantly overcaps resources. This is something Demon Hunters are already used to with Fury. You regularly overcap Fury in Mythic Plus. Spending Fury efficiently prior to patch 10.2 just isn't very important. Correctly spending all of your soul fragments is what fuels your damage output, your healing, and your damage reduction. Managing Fury? Basically, it does none of that in a Mythic Plus setup. This is very different from the raid play style in which you want to generate and spend as much Fury as you possibly can at all times to maintain frailty stacks. The soul fragments still matter, but they're not the linchpin of the class. They're not the essential resource that you've built your rotation around. It's a bit like Monk, where the talent loadout and the objectives of the rotation are very different between Raid and Mythic Plus, and I think that's okay. I think it's fine to have some nuance. I think Demon Hunter actually does this a lot better than Monk, because you're not reworking the entire rotation from the ground up as a Demon Hunter to maximize your damage output like you do as a Monk. You're just tweaking the way you manage resources. I think it's generally pretty good and pretty effective. That being said, it is weird to make a spec that can happily just overcap one of its resources all the time, and that's basically the right way to play it. And that's how Demon Hunter has worked in Mythic Plus up until Season 3. It works well. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just weird, and it kind of does seem like a bad design, but it's very effective. But it's also going away in patch 10.2. Demon Hunters in Mythic Plus and in Raids are going to want to maximize both Fury generation and Soul Fragment generation all the time. They're going to try to not waste either resource. And, managing both without overcapping will kind of be the determining factor of whether you're doing your rotation correctly. We'll get back to that in a bit more detail once we get to the new tier set bonuses, but for now, the weird divide on how you manage resources, which has been strange part of the class design for a really long time, is going away in patch 10.2. Now let's talk about the new talent tree. In the class tree, Sigil of Flame has been removed. It's a baseline skill for all Demon Hunters. This is a buff. Sigil of Misery has taken its place at the top of the tree. It's a good CC skill, and it's free of your vengeance. This is a buff. Pathing has been improved massively throughout both trees. This is a buff. Tons of 2-point talents throughout both trees have been reduced to 1-point talents. For the most part, their value per point has been increased. In some cases, you get 5% more health for a 1-point talent that used to cost 2 points and give you 6% total. In other cases, you just get the full value of the old 2-point talent. It just costs 1 point now. This is a buff. Metamorphosis has had its base cooldown reduced from 4 minutes to 3, and the talent that reduces its cooldown by 1 minute has been moved and made very easy to pick up. This means the cooldown of Metamorphosis for Vengeance Demon Hunters is 2 minutes. This is a buff. Fell Devastation has had its cooldown reduced by 20 seconds, and the other talents and things that affect it in the class tree and the base class have been either buffed or remain unchanged. This is a buff. Aura of Pain, the talent sitting in a choice node with Fellblade, has been moved. They are no longer in conflict with each other, and this means you can easily take both Fellblade and Aura of Pain. This is a buff. The bottom of both talent trees have been shuffled around significantly. Quicken Sigils, the talent that reduced the activation time on sigils by 1 second and reduced their base cooldowns by 20%, has had that second part removed. This is a nerf. Elysian Decree has been moved to the class tree. The Hunt has been moved down in the class tree, and this means you can no longer reach all three of Collective Anguish, the Hunt, and Elysian Decree at the same time. This is a nerf. Flames of Fury has been redesigned to massively increase the damage of Sigil of Flame. This is a buff. Fodder to the Flame has been removed. This is maybe a nerf. In the spec tree, a new talent named Ascending Flame has been added to the class tree. It increases the initial damage of Sigil of Flame and allows multiple Sigil of Flames to overlap. This is a buff. The right-hand side of the spec tree has been shuffled to no longer require pathing through as many weak talents to reach the bottom of the tree. This is a big buff. Chains of Anger now also increases the duration of your sigils by 2 seconds. This is a buff. Charred Flesh causes Immolation Aura to extend the duration of Sigil of Flames on enemies in addition to Fiery Brand. This is a huge buff. Burning Alive has been reworked to cause Fiery Brand to spread every 1 second instead of every 2. Fiery Brand also deals damage every 1 second instead of every 2. This is a big quality of life increase. It's not a numerical buff, it deals the same amount of damage over the span of its duration, but it feels great. We're calling it a buff. Fiery Brand has had its base duration increased by 2 seconds. This is a buff. Sigil of Chains has been moved to a much easier to reach position in the middle of the spec tree, and it is not essential for pathing into the bottom half of the tree either. Buff. Dark Glare Boon has been moved to the bottom of the tree. It only costs 1 point now, but it hasn't lost any power. Buff. Cycle of Binding has been secretly retooled to grant cooldown reduction when you use Elysian Decree, which I may be misremembering, but I don't think it worked like that in the past. We're gonna say buff. And finally, Down in Flames. The Fiery Brand talent is part of a choice node with a new talent, Illuminated Sigils. Illuminated Sigils gives all of your sigil skills, including Elysian Decree, 2 charges. It also grants 20% parry chance against enemies affected by Sigil of Flame. This is an insane buff. It completely creates a new playstyle for Demon Hunters alongside talents like Charred Flesh, Cycle of Binding, and Chains of Anger. The Sigil playstyle is real. You gain tremendous uptime on Sigil of Flame, upwards of 80% even with bad play, potentially 100% with good play and good gear. Sigil of Flame deals tons of damage. This also means it deals a lot of healing. It generates Fury and Souls, and it increases your parry chance by 20%. This all comes along with nearly all of the things that made Demon Hunters good in Mythic Plus in the past. The only thing you're losing is the Season 2 tier set bonus, which was great, but given how much new stuff is pouring in, all of this is cumulatively a massive buff to the class. Also, a lot of random skills have had their damage increased. This is a buff. Demon Hunter is ready to absolutely obliterate Mythic Plus in Season 3 of Dragonflight. Will it be good in raids? I don't think so. I think it'll be fine. I don't think it'll be bad. The parry chance? It's okay. It's fine. The playstyle is good. I think everything about this is reasonably good in raids, but it doesn't fix any of the old outstanding issues. Your damage and defenses suffer in single target, you struggle to manage boss mechanics, your group utility is limited, your defensive cooldowns suck, and that's still really not a great combination for a raid tank. I also think that there's a very real possibility that you take most of the talents that synergize with the Sigil of Flames playstyle in raids, but you still run Down in Flames and mainly play the Fiery Brand playstyle. This is disappointing to me. It is the direction the Demon Hunter community has been going in raid testing, and having played with the Sigil build in some Emerger Sil testing, I have to say it's not impressive. I think the Fiery Brand approach is probably the right move for raids despite not being new and cool. So that has been kind of disappointing, but not really. I've never really thought of Demon Hunter as an important raid tank because it hasn't been. It's great in Mythic Plus and it's getting even better there, and that's the big positive takeaway here. Now let's really juice this thing up. Let's talk about the new tier set, which I think has to have been made with this talent redesign in mind. They synergize so beautifully with each other. Here are the bonuses. 2-piece bonus first. When you attack a target affected by Sigil of Flame, your damage and healing are increased by 2% and your stamina is increased by 2% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Here's the 4-piece. Sigil of Flame's periodic damage has a chance to flare up, shattering an additional soul fragment from the target and dealing a moderate amount of damage. Each 40 Fury you spend reduces the cooldown of Sigil of Flame by 1 second. So now let's go through these bonuses numerically. Playing around a bit on dummies, before a recent buff that added 2 seconds to the base duration of Sigil of Flame, and frankly not even playing all that well, I was able to get around 70% uptime on Sigil of Flame. I think, in addition to that buff, but also with more practice and effort, I think it's very reasonable that you could approach 100% uptime on Sigil of Flame. So in the time that I started writing this and testing and then so on, Blizzard did add that 2 seconds of extra Sigil of Flame uptime. I've tested it from both sides of the equation, and it should be better. It should be 100% easily, but we'll get to that in a second. With the buff and Chains of Anger, you get 10 seconds per Sigil of Flame. Upwards of 90% uptime should at least, at the sort of minimum, be very easily attainable thanks to Charred Flesh extending the duration of Sigil of Flame. And that's all great. However, there is a bug, and I think it was present before the buff. I have kind of looked at some of my logs, and it seems like it was there, but it's definitely here. I've even got some video of it. I've literally just watched the video of it happening twice in a row. It's the old Iron Fur bug. The Iron Fur bug, in case you're not familiar, is a bug that druids had with Iron Fur for, like, I don't know, years. Iron Fur is a stacking buff. You can apply multiple stacks of it, and they overlap in power, but they don't refresh the duration. So sometimes when you would reapply an Iron Fur stack as one was about to expire, both stacks would just immediately expire. So you would press Iron Fur, spin the rage, and not have Iron Fur. This is exactly what's happening with Sigil of Flame. Sigil of Flame could stack multiple times thanks to Ascending Flames. So as a clever boy who was really trying to get 100% uptime for this hype speech, I would hit a training dummy with Sigil of Flame just as the previous Sigil of Flame was about to expire. The Sigil of Flame hits, it deals damage, the debuff immediately expires, no Sigil of Flame active at all. Now, like I said, this bug, I'm pretty confident was occurring before today's patch, but it's significantly worse since the patch. Maybe I'm just kind of like timing everything perfectly to screw it up. I definitely had some real difficulty actually doing just to sit there and do 2-minute dummy test and not lose uptime to this bug. That was pretty tough. So I opted to math out how much uptime I would have if the bug was not in the game, and I'm over 90%, which is great. I've also talked to some other players who are testing, and they've been getting very close to 100% uptime over the span of several minutes when they don't have this bug pop up, so I'll take it. That's justification. I count that. All the math in the testing indicates that it should be very possible to hit 100% uptime. Other people are saying it's easily doable for them. That works for me. My chief concern is whether this bug will be fixed before the patch. It really, really needs to be. I also think the 2-piece bonus should probably be bumped out to 10, 12, 15, or maybe even 20 seconds, just so that it is easier to maintain between pulls in Mythic Plus, and when dealing with boss mechanics and raids. 8 seconds for a buff that grants 10% damage, healing, and health, specifically, is too short. Having to do a boss mechanic and also losing 10% health as punishment on top of the boss's damage is really bad. Other than that limitation, it's 10% more damage, healing, and health. That's pretty great. Now let's examine the 4-piece bonus. The cooldown reduction is the easier part to quantify, so let's start there. A good Vengeance Demon Hunter in a raid is going to generate at least 15 Fury per second, so that's sort of a minimum. Examining how much people generate in Mythic Plus prior to 10.2 is kind of worthless since it's largely been a vestigial resource up until this point. I was able to generate 15 a second very consistently on training dummies with no lust or time warp or any buffs like that. I think 20 Fury per second might be doable in raid with the addition of Fellblade, but you're going to have some overcapping, some waste, and I mean, you would really need to be playing well for that number to be achievable, so we'll just stick to 15. That's a good conservative number anyways. Okay, so at 15 Fury per second, you're triggering that 40 Fury cooldown reduction on average every 2.67 seconds. So basically getting 3.67 seconds of cooldown reduction in that time. That's around 38% more cooldown reduction on your Sigil of Flame, which is about 8 or 9 seconds off of the base cooldown. Pretty good. Cycle of Binding grants 3 seconds of cooldown reduction to all of your sigils each time you hit an enemy with a sigil. That's a little more difficult to quantify since Sigil of Silence, Sigil of Misery, and Sigil of Chains are all utility skills that you're not going to just like hit on cooldown rotationally. I would say in general, you're probably going to be around 12 to 15 seconds on an average Sigil of Flame cooldown. Once you factor in that you're also getting added Sigil of Flame uptime from Charred Flesh, the possibility of hitting 100% uptime is pretty reasonable. Ultimately, look, there's a lot of moving parts here, a lot of synergistic talents and bonuses that all positively affect each other and interlap in complicated ways. I think it's great, but, you know, it can be a lot to keep in your head all at once. The main takeaway is just that Sigil of Flame uptime is good, it does a lot of damage and healing, and that's great. As for the damage flare-up component of the 4-piece, it went through some iteration early on in the PTR. It was scaling linearly with target count, so like against 10 enemies, it would just be 10 times stronger than it was against only one. I mean, that's sort of the whole Demon Hunter thing, right? But thankfully that was tuned down a bit so that it has diminishing returns after the first target. This is probably for the best. In my testing, it procs pretty often. It's worth about 3 to 5% more damage on average, which isn't a huge amount, but it also adds like 10 to 15% more soul fragments, which is pretty good. They can be wasteful. Sometimes, you know, they're random spawns. So sometimes they'll spawn when you already have 5 or whatever, but they can just as easily be useful and kind of help your rotation out. So I think it'll all balance out in the end. You certainly can't ever complain about having more soul fragments available. In general, this is a really good tier set. We're talking 15 to 20% more damage pretty easily, 10% bonus healing and 10% bonus health, cooldown reduction on a major rotational skill, extra soul fragments. It's all really nice, and it synergizes with the new talent build beautifully. I love it. All right, let's wrap up. Vengeance Demon Hunter has a very short legacy compared to the other 5 tanks. But in the 7 years that it has existed, it's established itself as being a very strong Mythic Plus tank and a very raid tank. I don't want to say that it's bad in raid. I don't think it is bad. I kind of think it's worse than bad. It's mid. It's not bad defensively. It's not great defensively. It's not bad offensively. It's not great offensively. It's fine. Middle of the road. It brings one form of useful raid utility, the Demon Hunter debuff. Havoc Demon Hunters also bring that debuff naturally, and Havoc's usually a pretty good spec. That alone is enough to render Vengeance a non-competitive raid tank most of the time. It's basically the mirror opposite of Monk, which is usually amazing in raids with a class design that is well suited to most boss mechanics, deals good to great single target damage, brings the same debuff as a consistently terrible DPS spec, Windwalker, and usually really sucks in Mythic Plus. This is purely a complaint about Vengeance Demon Hunter and raids, and there are still plenty of players who use them in progression raiding. You can do it, it's allowed. It's usually not that popular, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. There are plenty of situations in which it would make sense. As for the redesign, it's basically just a big fat buff across the board. Fodder to the Flame enjoyers may be upset, but that's about the only person who I could think of that would look at this and not be thrilled. This is basically a huge buff to a class that was already competitive. Blizzard did make a change earlier this week that is a clear-cut nerf, and it's to the Aberrus tier set bonuses. They're getting hacked and slashed. I get the point, they want people to switch to the new tier set as soon as it's available, not hang on to the old stuff. I think that's all fine. We knew the old one wasn't gonna last. I'm surprised that they did it before the patch came along instead of waiting until, I don't know, like a couple of weeks in. But even with that change, I think Demon Hunter logs in on patch day feeling buffed. It's kind of lame to have your tier set pre-nerfed. It was probably the strongest tier set in the game though, so it's fine. In terms of Vengeance Demon Hunter's value in Mythic Plus in Season 3, it's probably the best tank in the game. I feel really non-controversial about saying that. It's the front runner. For one, it's new and interesting, and unlike some classes, Paladin, I'm talking about Paladin, it has a fun, cool tier set. Beyond that, it's tanky. It has well over 50% parry chance with the new talent build, which is just insane. It also has great damage, great self-healing, and it even has great group utility by bringing both the correct group damage buff for Mythic Plus, unlike Monk and Warrior, and by crowd controlling everything it sees. Here's a rundown of all the crowd control Vengeance Demon Hunter has, just to kind of hammer this point home. It has an AoE Silence, it has an AoE Fear, and it has an AoE Grip. All of those have 2 charges, and they get their cooldowns reduced by your rotation. They also grant cooldown reduction to your rotation, so you have an offensive incentive to use your crowd controls as a Demon Hunter as well. This rules, but wait, there's more. Demon Hunter also has an AoE stun and imprison. It also has an offensive dispel, and since most Demon Hunters are Blood Elves, it has an AoE dispel as well. It's hard to overstate just how powerful Sigil of Silence is. Vengeance Demon Hunters, kind of like Paladins, are going to be a top tier tank in Season 3 of Dragonflight Mythic Plus, almost entirely because of their ability to banish caster mobs to the Shadow Realm. Once you factor in everything else that Demon Hunter has going on, it really looks poised to be the best. I guess we'll find out soon enough. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.